Well, today, the blue wall of silence around police work in America was broken. It was broken under oath in the murder trial of a police officer by the police chief who fired that officer within hours of watching a video that was posted on social media by a 17-year-old girl who bravely recorded that video. In decades of covering trials of police officers on homicide charges or in wrongful death lawsuits, I have never heard testimony like we heard today from the Minneapolis police chief, Madera Arredondo. We have seen police chiefs try to cover up killings like this. That's much more common than what we saw today. We have heard police chiefs make excuses for police officers in unjustified uses of deadly force, and that is much more common than what we saw today. And we have heard police chiefs make absolutely no comment whatsoever in cases like this, just be part of that silent blue wall. That's what we have come to expect. We have not heard a police chief come forward as an important witness for the prosecution in a nationally televised murder trial of a police officer. Chief Arredondo testified that the first video that he reviewed on the night George Floyd was killed was from a permanent police surveillance camera that is positioned at that busy intersection in Minneapolis, which captured the action on the street from a certain distance. And there was not enough detail in that video for the chief to be alarmed by what he saw. And then, hours later, the chief heard about another video.
Probably close to midnight, a community member had contacted me and said, Chief, almost verbatim, but said, Chief, have you seen the video of your officer choking and killing that man at 30th and Chicago? And so once I heard that statement, I just knew it wasn't the same milestone camera video that I had saw. And eventually, within minutes after that, I saw for the first time what is now known as the bystander video.
So around midnight, the Minneapolis police chief saw the most important video in this case, the video recorded by 17-year-old Darnella Frazier showing Derek Chauvin's knee on George Floyd's neck for what we now know to be 9 minutes and 29 seconds. It was on the basis of Darnella Frazier's video that the police chief fired all 4 of the police officers who were at the scene hours after he saw that video. Today, the most important piece of testimony Chief Arredondo delivered was that Derek Chauvin should have taken his knee off George Floyd's neck after the first few seconds.
When do you believe, or do you have a belief as to when this restraint, the restraint on the ground that you viewed, should have stopped?
Once Mr. Floyd, and this is based on my viewing of the videos, once Mr. Floyd had stopped resisting, and certainly once he was in distress and trying to verbalize that, that should have stopped. There's an initial reasonableness in trying to just get him under control in the first few seconds, but once there was no longer any resistance, and clearly when Mr. Floyd was no longer responsive and even motionless, to continue to apply that level of force to a person proned out, handcuffed behind their back, that in no way, shape, or form is anything that is by policy, is not part of our training, and it is certainly not part of our ethics or our values.
The first few seconds, Derek Chauvin's knee was on George Floyd's neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. And according to the police chief's testimony today, that was more than 9 minutes too long. You will be hearing that phrase in the prosecutor's final argument to the jury, the first few seconds. Everything beyond the first few seconds was, according to the police chief, a violation of Minneapolis Police Department's rules and ethics and values.
So is it your belief then that this particular form of restraint, if that's what we'll call it, in fact violates departmental policy?
I absolutely agree that violates our policy.
What was sadly on display today in the courtroom was the constantly recurring fact that police training does not work. Police training did not work for Derek Chauvin. Derek Chauvin ignored all of his police training when he had his knee on George Floyd's neck. We heard today that police training requires police officers like Derek Chauvin to provide first aid to anyone in their custody who seems to be in physical distress. And we watched Derek Chauvin refusing to do that for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. The emergency room physician, who was the first to see George Floyd at the hospital, said George Floyd might have survived if Derek Chauvin had taken his knee off George Floyd's neck and administered first aid.
It's well known that any amount of time that a patient spends in cardiac arrest without immediate CPR markedly decreases the chance of a good outcome. Approximately 10 to 15% decrease in survival for every minute that CPR is not administered.
Every minute that CPR is not administered, every minute counted. Police officers are trained to know that every minute counts. Police training was completely wasted on Derek Chauvin and the other 3 officers who have been charged in George Floyd's murder. The Minneapolis Police Rulebook stresses something that Derek Chauvin appears to have never once thought about during those 9 minutes and 29 seconds. The sanctity of life.
Can you please read the first sentence under subparagraph A?
Yes. Sanctity of life and the protection of the public shall be the cornerstones of the MPD's use of force policy.
What does that mean?
Of all the things that we do as peace officers for the Minneapolis Police Department, and I mentioned the thousands of calls that our men and women respond to. It is my firm belief that the one singular incident we will be judged forever on will be our use of force. And so while it is absolutely imperative that our officers go home at the end of their shift, we want to make sure and ensure that our community members go home too. And so sanctity of life is absolutely vital, that is the pillar for our use of force.
Leading off our discussion tonight are Kirk